Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. It's Thursday, the 20th of March here in London. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, Jerome Powell calls tariff risks transitory as he seeks to downplay growth and inflation concerns.
Unleashing a new China shock, we look at the unintended consequences of Trump's tariffs on developing economies.
Plus, getting creative, how wealthy people in the UK are adopting new strategies to limit the effects of changes to inheritance tax.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
The Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell has downplayed concerns about US economic growth and the impact of President Trump's trade war on inflation as the central bank held rates steady for a second straight meeting. Speaking to reporters following the two-day policy meeting, Powell went as far as reviving the controversial term transitory.
It can be the case that it's appropriate sometimes to look through inflation if it's going to go away quickly without action by us, if it's transitory. And that can be the case in the case of tariff inflation. I think that would depend on the tariff inflation moving through fairly quickly, and it would depend critically as well on inflation expectations being well anchored, longer-term inflation expectations being well anchored.
Powell's use of transitory was surprising to many after the Fed used the same term when inflation exploded after the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Fed chair went on to call that scenario the base case, but then proceeded to say officials really can't know if the tariff effects will be temporary.
The S&P 500 moved higher as Powell spoke, and Treasury yields dropped as markets continue to look for clues on the impact of President Trump's trade policies. In a post on Truth Social, President Trump wrote, quote, "The Fed would be much better off cutting rates as US tariffs start to ease their way into the economy," end quote. The decision to actively lobby the Fed for lower interest rates came just hours after White House National Economic Council Director Kevin Hassett tried to reassure investors about the central bank's independence in this back and forth with reporters.
We very much respect the independence of the Fed. There's a massive literature that independent central banks perform better for economies, and so I don't think that's a dispute.
So he doesn't think he can fire the Fed?
I think that's been resolved in the previous administration.
Kevin Hassett was speaking as the Trump administration prepares to announce a fresh wave of so-called reciprocal tariffs on the 2nd of April.
New Bloomberg reporting is showing how US tariffs are reshaping global trade. Emerging markets are facing a so-called China shock as cheap goods arrive in developing countries. Ewan Potts has the details.
China's trade surplus last year reached a record of close to $1 trillion. But as exports to the US flatline, China's hyper-competitive manufacturers have been targeting other markets around the world. Bloomberg's been looking at the pressures being faced by the likes of Indonesia, Brazil, Thailand and Vietnam, as well as big-ticket items like electrical vehicles and solar panels. China's exporters are causing job losses in sectors like electrical goods, textiles and shoemaking. One academic described it to us as China Shock 2.0. I'm Ewan Potts, Bloomberg Radio.
Now, the Bank of England is expected to leave the benchmark interest rate on hold later today. Markets and economists believe the Monetary Policy Committee will hold borrowing costs at 4.5%, while reiterating a cautious approach to further cuts. Speaking earlier this month, Governor Andrew Bailey said that although the impact of trade tariffs on inflation can be ambiguous, in his words, he did warn the risks to the UK economy from Trump's tariff war, quote, are substantial.
President Vladimir Zelensky has backed a US proposal for Ukraine and Russia to stop strikes on energy infrastructure. The Ukrainian leader told US President Donald Trump it would be one of the first steps to fully ending the war. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt says the call helped move towards ending the war.
The two leaders also agreed on a partial ceasefire against energy. Technical teams will meet in Saudi Arabia in the coming days to discuss broadening the ceasefire to the Black Sea on the way to a full ceasefire. They agreed this could be the first step toward the full end of the war and ensuring security.
Leavitt also described the conversation with Zelensky as fantastic, and a US aide described a previous call with Putin as epic. 2 weeks ago, the US temporarily cut off Ukraine's military aid and intelligence sharing, but promised fresh support after Presidents Trump and Zelensky spoke. Meanwhile, EU leaders are meeting in Brussels today to discuss ramping up their defence capabilities. While the EU has publicly welcomed US efforts to push for a peace deal, leaders have become increasingly alarmed about being kept out of Trump's dealings with the Kremlin.
The next generation of UK nuclear submarines starts construction today as concerns grow about the country's reliance on America for its defence. Prime Minister Keir Starmer is attending a ceremony to mark the work starting on a new Dreadnought-class submarine. James Woolcock has more now.
Britain's nuclear submarines are emblematic of the country's defence debate. Despite being the country's ultimate nuclear deterrent, all 4 subs are active beyond their 25-year service life and rely on America for maintenance. Keir Starmer's rare visit is a way to highlight to the public the need to improve the country's defences. But the next generation will be debated too. It's Britain's most expensive military procurement programme, costing an estimated £36 billion. That's 6 years' worth of the government's welfare cuts announced earlier this week. In London, James Woolcock, Bloomberg Radio.
And Finland's unbroken streak as the world's happiest country has continued for an 8th year, with the UK in 23rd place in the global ranking. The US came in at 24th for happiness, its lowest ever level. The study by the Wellbeing Research Centre at the University of Oxford is based on a 3-year average of a population's self-assessment of its quality of life. Researchers found that belief in the kindness of others is much more closely tied to happiness than previously thought. Denmark, Iceland, Sweden and the Netherlands rounded out the top 5.
And those are your top stories this morning. Now, let's look at the markets. US stock futures are up, so perhaps a little bit happier after Fed Chair Jerome Powell reassured them in terms of the fears over tariffs. Although, of course, President Trump talking about his view that the Fed would be much better off cutting interest rates. That doesn't really seem to have landed with investors. Will it at some point? 10-year US Treasury yields are flat for 24, although remember that Japanese markets are closed for a holiday today. The Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index is slightly stronger this morning. The Japanese yen extending Wednesday's recovery. Gold hitting a fresh record high this morning. The euro trades at 1.0898, so slightly softer right now. That is a look at the markets.
In a moment, we'll bring you more on how Trump's tariffs are pushing Chinese exports into other markets, plus how wealthy people in the UK are developing new strategies to avoid paying inheritance tax. But another story that caught our eye this morning, a bottle of whiskey, a very rare bottle of whiskey, encased in what looks like concrete to try and add to its rarity value. Have we reached peak collector whiskey? Quite possibly.
Yes, because the whole idea of this Scottish distiller, Glenrothes, releasing its oldest and rarest single malt is that it's meant to be drunk. You're meant to smash the bottle because apparently once you smash the bottle, then you can't resell it. Or the casing around the bottle, you can't then resell the bottle because it's almost like selling the bottle without the casing. But
the extent to which they've gone with this. So our writer Brad Jaffe has tasted the whiskey. I'll let you read his description, but the bottom line is it's good. Right. But the idea is you can break the packaging, then you can send it back to the distillery, who will get a kintsugi artist to reassemble the column, filling in the cracks using gold in accordance with the Japanese practice as well. So there's a whole collector's element to this. But it's a very interesting dilemma because unlike other high-end collectibles, of course, it is a consumable good. So you have to make the decision as to whether you're keeping the action figure in its packaging or you're taking it out and playing with it, essentially.
I like that. Yeah, it's such a nice story. Anyway, one to think about. I might be smashing the bottle maybe later for a hot toddy, if anyone can hear my little bit of a cold this morning.
Let's bring you more there on our top story this morning and the latest on the trade tariffs. But our reporting looking at how President Trump's determination to rebalance the US's trade relationship with Beijing is pushing Chinese manufacturers and exporters to look for alternative markets. It's unleashing a new China shock on the rest of the world, with job losses and economic devastation in Indonesia and other emerging markets. Let's bring in our Asia economics reporter Katia Dmitrieva for more on this story. Katia, Indonesia was your case study in this reporting. What's happened to jobs and the textile industry there?
Well, it's pretty grim, especially in the past year in Indonesia, because there has been such a fast pace of layoffs, particularly in textiles and shoes elsewhere as well, and in other emerging markets. But in Indonesia, it's really being felt there. And a large reason for that, people there are blaming, and workers and industry groups are blaming China and cheap Chinese imports. And we've seen other countries in the region reacting to that as well by putting in taxes against companies like Temu and Shein, because a lot of the goods are coming in that way. A lot of the clothing is coming in that way in these small packages. But essentially what's happening is very similar to what we saw in the U.S. Rust Belt, right? In the 90s and early 2000s, when China first came onto the scene in global trade, we saw a lot of lost jobs, 2.4 million in the U.S. And while those numbers are not as high in Indonesia, of course, smaller population, they are much faster. The job loss is happening at a much faster pace.
Yeah, but of course, China's trade surplus has hit an all-time high. And so the goods that China's manufacturing, they have to go somewhere. Who else is being affected?
Yeah, in 2024, hitting nearly $1 trillion. And so Indonesia is one of them. Southeast Asia in particular is interesting because these countries are, I mean, they're certainly geographically close to China, but geopolitically speaking, historically, are very close. And they rely on China for a lot of foreign direct investment, building of infrastructure, roads, things of that nature. And so to have these countries facing this challenge is most recently it stands out, right? But there's also Brazil. There's Mexico, and President Sheinbaum there is doing a lot right now to try to limit, again, these cheaper goods from entering. And again, that's, clothing, it's shoes, it's steel, but it's also components and kind of these smaller parts that go into big machines and manufacturers use, and is, having the dual effect of both hitting demand in the domestic economy. So people are buying these cheap Chinese goods domestically, but also competing internationally is just that much harder when you're competing with China.
How much leverage do these countries have to actually be able to push back against China? I mean, they don't have the same economic heft as the US.
Yeah, and this is what makes this shock quite different, right? The shock 2.0 or 3.0 is quite different in that a lot of these economies can't really push back. They have industries coming to them, and a lot of the folks profiled in our story are going directly to their industry groups, who are going directly to the government and commerce and trade and saying, we need to put in tariffs or something to stop this. And you're seeing some of that. There's some investigations into steel dumping. There are some tariffs on small packages or like a value-added tax, but they're really limited. Because if they take too strong of a stance, well, there goes your foreign direct investment, there goes your relationship, and certainly your geopolitical ties, which is something that countries would be concerned about. So they're really between a rock and a hard place.
Katya, thank you so much for being with us this morning. Our Asia economics reporter, Katya Dmitrieva. And you can read that story in full. Trump's tariffs unleash a new China shock on the rest of the world. In-depth reporting.
Here in the UK, major changes to inheritance tax by the Labour government means more wealthy Britons are embracing creative tactics to protect and pass on wealth, especially businesses, farmland and pensions. Joining us now to discuss, Bloomberg's personal finance and wealth reporter, Alice Cantor. Alice, good morning. Remind us, first of all, what has the government changed when it comes to inheritance tax?
The government has overhauled the tax system so that from next year and the year after, pensions, businesses and farmland, they'll all be included in a person's estate. And what that means is that when in the past, people could pass on their pension and businesses mostly tax-free, now they'll be taxed at maybe 20%, sometimes even 40%.
And so what are the strategies then that people are thinking about or employing to basically pass on that wealth or that business and try, to find a creative way around this?
Yes, so people are drawing down on they're drawing down on their pensions. They're gifting more money to family members and sooner as well. They're establishing trusts. Some are taking out costly life insurance policies. They're considering selling their businesses. They're considering setting up savings accounts for their kids, even leaving the country in some cases, just to avoid paying the levy, to avoid putting all that pressure on their children when they pass on.
Are there downsides to these strategies, Alice? What are the people that you spoke to most concerned about or perhaps complaining about the most?
So most wealth advisors, they say that no matter the strategies that you put in place, the reality is that this tax is going to hurt because there's only so much money that you can draw on from your pensions pot without being taxed on that as well. And then there's only so much money you can take away from your business without having some implications as well on the running of the business itself. So one problem that people are encountering is that they often have young children who aren't ready to take over their businesses. And so it would be foolish to kind of try to pass on too much too early and then deal with the consequences of that. And then family dynamics might also change. So imagine that you give too much to a family member that you end up having a confrontation with, and you might want to change what you've done there. So inheritance tax planning in general is just really hard because of end of life, healthcare costs, because of life expectancy that are all quite unpredictable by nature. So people, they want to give money to their family, they want to protect them, but they also want to keep enough for themselves.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.